Welcome to the riskadvisor.com podcast. I am Jim Henry here with my good friend and co-host Sal Lafreri. Today's topic, facial recognition. In today's world, everything is questioned and second-guessed. Mostly everything is wrong to someone. Technology is advancing and is presenting challenges we could never anticipate. Social pressures are being exerted at great levels. Security providers and developers must try to maintain a relationship with clients and live between what is good technology and what is bad technology and the client's benefit. The shiny new toy of today is tomorrow's old hat. Walking that line has become a critical element in today's world. So, Sal, no challenges there, right?
We could have done a whole show just on that. God, Jesus. Yeah, unintended consequences. That's the thing that just keeps ringing through to my head with all of this, right? You have new technologies. For starters, right? You got the technology that gets developed and there's no law to cover it. And you find that, people are utilizing it in bad ways or in ways that we wind up realizing that we wind up with a victimization. And then you wind up with other technology issues come up. And you find that, you're pissing somebody off somewhere along the line. And the line that you got to walk today is just incredible, right? You're trying to do the right thing for the client. You want to make the right offer. You want to bring the right technologies in, and you wind up with, outside groups and outside influences starting to attack the technology and start attacking what you want to do. And, there are times, and we've said this, off air a number of times where you sit there, you just shake your head and you go, what are you supposed to do? How do you react to this stuff? So unintended consequences, it's just one of those things. And I think today's topic, highlights that.
Well, the criticism gets misdirected. It's not about good and bad technology. It's how the technology is used. And that's
actually how it's perceived, not even how it's used. It's how it's perceived.
That is true.
Yeah.
That is true.
Let's get to our guest.
Yes. With us today, joining us for the second time, we're glad to have back, is Alan Stoddard. Alan is an experienced global security technology executive with a long background in security and telecommunications as vice president and general manager of Verint's Situational Intelligence Solutions business unit for the past 4 years. Has helped transform this VMS supplier into a global leader in developing and delivering intelligent security solutions for mission-critical environments. He has a degree in aerospace engineering from MIT. Prior to Verint, held senior management positions with Honeywell, Security, AMX, and Nortel Networks.
Hey, Jim.
So,
thrilled to be
Alan,
here.
Welcome.
Jim, Sal.
Welcome back.
Thank you very much.
So we're hearing a lot of discussion about facial recognition in the market. What is the reality in terms of how facial recognition is being adopted in today's environment?
Yeah, well, I think you alluded to it, right, to a certain extent, unintended consequences, but it's varied. I think I remember we were just talking about trade shows and when we can get back to a trade show here after COVID. But the last 2-3 years, go out to Vegas and all you saw was facial recognition, biometrics, and artificial intelligence, and it was going to take over the world. And the reality, in terms of what we've seen, has been much more mixed, right? Certainly, there are pockets and areas where the adoption has been very high, penetration is great, but there's been a lot of misses, right? For all sorts of reasons we talked about, and I don't think it's really, despite the capabilities of the technology, this is one of those areas that I think is a fascinating case study, and technology isn't enough, right? It's got to be the right alignment of technology, of business case, of regulation and acceptance in the marketplace, and any number of other things to really get to the tipping point for some of these capabilities to really hit their stride. And with respect to facial recognition, certainly we're not there yet. It has been an uneven journey to this point.
Right. A few years ago, it's probably 5 years ago now, Ray Coulombe founder and president of
Yeah.
Security Specifiers and a fellow MIT grad.
Yeah, I know, right?
And a real industry evangelist. Had a great session down at TechSec in Florida, and he called it the Battle of the Body Parts. And so you've got a very educated audience there at TechSec, and it was like a bake-off presentations between people that were doing fingerprint biometric technology, vascular, iris, all the different technologies, including facial, for each to make their case. And at the end of the presentations, Ray took a poll within the audience as to what did the audience think was going to be the surviving biometric to come out of this. And overwhelmingly, the vote was facial recognition, that eventually that would win the day because of its ease of use, the ergonomics, and of course now in a COVID environment where you're dealing with concerns about, fingerprint, validation for multi-factor. You don't have that issue with facial, and as a rule, you wear your face out there in public, and you're allowing people to see who you are. So the violation of your privacy is much more diminished, and you're not exposing yourself to the illumination or whatnot of your retina or what people perceive to be, even if it's iris recognition, something that's going to damage your eye. So again, I think that the common belief within our industry continues to be and is accelerated now that facial will be it. And I think our challenges have moved from the accuracy of the technology to just the acceptance of its use politically, right?
Yeah, so much there, right? And I think generally you're right, but it's interesting. Sometimes we kind of get caught up in what's the silver bullet, right? What's the one solution that's going to work? And I think we always need to think about the fact that lots of different solutions can coexist depending on the unique requirements and the specific requirements of the use case, right? And sometimes different elements drive the decision making. Whether it's is 95% accuracy okay, or do you need 99.99% accuracy, right? How much cost are you willing to deploy? What's the environment? Do you have limited throughput, on people, and they can go through a turnstile or a gate or an iris reader, or are you trying to do mass, acceptance in a lobby where you're looking at, tens and 20s of people coming through in high volume? So I think different use cases, and when it comes to analytics, all of these capabilities will continue to coexist. But back to the point, I think human evolution tells us there's real value in terms of facial recognition. That's how we live, right? That's how society's grown up. We don't look check out people's irises, and we don't ask them for their for their thumbprints. And the technology, to your point, certainly has come a very long way. Now there's I think when you start to talk about facial recognition, there's still a pretty good span of capabilities. There's a lot of solutions out there today that are so, right, for cheap and free, and to get a really high degree of accuracy and speed, and minimize some of the biases that exist in the technology. You need higher processing, higher degree of training and learning, et cetera, but they can be very good. So I think there's a lot of things to recommend facial recognition for a lot of use cases and applications out there. And to your point, fundamentally, the technology today is really, truly incredible. We've seen, we've done a lot of demonstrations for our customers, going through with hard hats on and safety goggles on and on the face and all sorts of things. And it is truly better than the human eye in almost every measure today. And that would recommend it for a lot of solutions, right, that we're trying to put in place. And that certainly is the state of the art, and it's out there. So that, to your point, that really should not be an impediment at this stage.
It makes you kind of wonder if you look at it in totality, where we are today with facial recognition, and you line that up next to social media. You just wonder where we would have gone through with fingerprinting if social media would have been around at the time. It's just too many people being able to take shots at it, too many people being able to question it. The conversation becomes a whole lot more, both good and bad, right? The conversation becomes a whole lot more involved with the advent of social media. Yeah. And you just wonder, you bring out a new technology with facial recognition, and you go back to fingerprinting, and you go, gee, I wonder what would have happened back then if it would have had the same outcry.
Well, it certainly amplifies the that voice, right, and that element of the voice. I think that's always been out there to a certain extent, though, with new technologies and new capabilities. It's whether it reaches the volume that we have today or not. I think is a real question. As you say, I sometimes I stop and think about facial recognition. I like to think about it the introduction of the automobile 120 years ago, and my God, we can't have these automobiles flying around. They could run into people, they could run into each other, right? There's no way to manage it. There's an intersection, and who's going to decide which one goes, and you're going to have an accident, you're going to kill people. Let's ban the whole darn thing, right? Mm-hmm. And it's not about the capability. It's about where we are as a society in terms of our understanding of it and our policies and rules to utilize it correctly, right? And the reality is, unfortunately, there is no doubt that there are places in the world where the technology has been misused, right? Absolutely no doubt. Countries and other organizations have misused the technology. And so, some of that concern is bred through that real misuse. But we tend to be reactive, right? And instead of simply saying, okay, how do we put the right guide rails in place? How do we put the right policies and procedures and regulations in place, right? We tend to sometimes jump to throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
That'll take us into the next area we'd like to talk about is success stories. But before we get into that, we just want to remind you that you're listening to the Risk Advisor podcast hosted by Jim Henry and Sal Lafreri. We ask you to download and subscribe to the show and rate us on iTunes or your favorite podcast platform. Also, follow us on our social media pages like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you happen to be interested in having one or both of us speak at an upcoming event or would like to consult with either one of us or both of us, please go to our webpage at theriskadvisor.com to set that up. So, Alan, we talked about some of the problematic areas and some of the misuses, but let's talk about some of the success stories you're seeing. Where is it really having a positive impact?
Yeah, it really is incredible. I think we directly have seen quite a few success stories out there, and I'm sure there are hundreds, thousands of stories that we don't necessarily have visibility to, but we just some that to me are really meaningful and powerful and that hit home, for us when you look at the context of what this technology can do it and what would be very challenging to do otherwise. We deployed it in a hospital, and there was a young nurse who had been abused by her partner, and there was a restraining order, and literally, she did not feel safe coming to work until the technology was deployed and the ability to make sure that that individual was not coming into the hospital without security getting flagged right before he was able to get anywhere close to where she was, and so this is a woman who was given back her ability to work and fulfill her her role in what she was looking to do in life. We've deployed it in retail environments, right, where we were able to use it to help capture abductors of children, right, and so could this have been done otherwise without the automation of facial recognition? Going through a ton of a video and doing that in a non-automated fashion, maybe, right? But as we know, time for something like that is critical, and the ability to speed that up, 100-fold with automated procedures almost certainly played a very large role in the ability to recover that individual. We've seen it deployed in a large, public setting in Southeastern Asia, very high-profile public event with great security concerns. And, we were able to identify over 20 known suspected terrorists that were entering into that restricted area that could have posed a significant threat to a high-level government figure, right? And they were able to be identified and questioned, before they were able to enter that area. So, the capabilities, I think, combined with the ability of video solutions today, the speed at which it can do, the accuracy, which is greater than the human eye at this point. There are things that we can do to keep people safe and secure people, secure facilities, secure areas that, in the day and age that we live in, everybody should be powerful, for all of us. to make sure that we're living in a safer environment. So they are real, and the stories are certainly out there.
So obviously you don't have the pushback in the communist dictatorships because there's no such thing as pushback in a communist dictatorship for long. But but in the democratic countries around the world, are you seeing much of a difference in the level of pushback with regards to privacy? And obviously, Europe has been pretty advanced with GDPR, and they're concerned, with privacy. How do you see that, working, between those different geographic regions?
Yeah, and it's a really good point. I think that's one of the, as a supplier and as an industry, the more uneven the adaptation of something, the adoption levels, the more of a challenge it is to really move forward. And we really have seen great differences. As you say, communist countries aside, I think most Western democracies, there's a certain level of concern, and again, appropriately so, to make sure it's managed appropriately. I think the real difference is in what have they done about it, right? And as you say, GDPR in Europe provides at least the advantage of a known quantity, right? It's the uncertainty is gone. You know what you need to do. Now, the challenge there is it's a pretty high bar, right? They really set a high bar in terms of what the restrictions are, and that's giving some people pause in terms of making sure they can really implement all the processes and controls and everything necessary that's asked for of GDPR. But it's known. And so people can make their decisions accordingly. I think in a lot of other areas that the challenge is that it's all over the map. In the U.S., for example, right now there's a bunch of states that are looking at it. We've got 4 states that have actually implemented specific regulations. It's being looked at Congress. So there's the uncertainty of if I deploy something, can I deploy it across the U.S. or is it going to run afoul of certain laws and regulations in certain states? Is the Congress going to do something about it? What are they going to do? And so that uncertainty level is even more paralyzing in some cases, right, than something like GDPR, because it's just the unknown. And as soon as you tell a bunch of lawyers that we don't know what's going to happen and what the rules are going to be, it's a lot easier for them to say no, right? Let's just stop. Let's wait.
Well, a good way for those Western democracies to demonstrate they're embracing it is actually to be deploying it themselves. Yeah. You see much of that deployment for public safety, by those European Western democracies? Yeah,
it really, we're seeing it a lot. It's hit and miss. We're seeing a lot more in democratic regions in South America and Southeast Asia and in India. Other democracies that maybe you get away from what you think of as the Western democracies in Western Europe and the U.S. and North America, you're seeing a fair bit of deployment elsewhere. It happens. It's hit and miss, right? It certainly in the U.S. there's been pockets of deployment. There have been pockets of deployment in Western Europe where they feel comfortable getting over that bar. But it's if you say, hey, at the state, at the municipal level, et cetera, are people really looking aggressively at this? The answer is no, right? Because they just don't know where it's going to happen.
How about the UK? The UK, 25 years ago, were really the leaders in town center, public area, closed circuit television surveillance. I mean, back in the days of analog, and they would have they would actually have civilians, watching the video, as a backup to help, guide the police on where they were seeing issues. How has it been going there?
Very little. And again, it's a perfect fit, right? You've got this incredibly widely deployed, video surveillance system throughout a lot of the urban areas there, with a mass of humans, right? Doing, looking at it, et cetera. It's a perfect fit to improve the effectiveness of all that, speed the response, do all the things that they're trying to do anyway, right? With less people and higher accuracy. And, with few exceptions. Again, I think there's some at the national security level, right? That we can't necessarily talk about, but they're there. But in terms of, the London police, et cetera, they haven't really embraced it. We've been involved in a number of opportunities and projects in the UK, some of their large transit systems, some other deployments, where at this point they have just made the decision to stop and wait and see. And, we actually had a fantastic trial that we had deployed that was really looking to utilize the system to protect some identified vulnerable people of the population from entering into areas that would be risky to them in high transportation areas, right? And ran a trial, very highly successful. Everybody was gung ho, and unfortunately at that point in time had the lawyers say, let's put it on hold, let's stop, let's wait, let's see where this thing evolves. So in the Western democracies, if you will, it is pretty hit and miss.
Just touch base real quick about talking about accuracy. So the studies that have been done, the technology obviously has come pretty far.
Yeah.
And now we're getting to the point where it's getting almost to the point of the same capability of fingerprinting. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, as I said, one of the big elements there is just I think there's more variability, right? So, fingerprinting's gotten to the point now. I like to think about things I grew up with, and it was back in the day when CDs were introduced, right? And you were really concerned about the quality of the CD player, and it was a big difference, right? How what the processing rate was, and how many times oversampling, and everything else, because you could hear the difference, right? And then about 2 years later, it was like, yeah, there was differences, but it was so far beyond what the human ear could hear, it didn't matter. They were all great, and $50, and it was a great CD player, right? Fingerprinting's kind of gotten there to that point. It's mature enough as a technology. Facial recognition, certainly the capability is there, but we're still in that area where there's a lot more variability, right, to what you get. You can get some, people talk about, free or low cost, or, what is available on the facial recognition side. That can be lower quality, much more dependent upon the camera angle, lighting, all sorts of things, or with a high degree of very advanced systems with higher processors, incredibly, incredibly accurate. And as I said, certainly to the point where far beyond what the human eye can perceive. And I think the other element associated with that is, clearly some of the concerns around bias, different ethnic biases, et cetera. And while those are real, they also tend to follow that spread. Lower end systems show a lot more bias, right? If you're really investing in a higher end system that's gone through the development, the training, you've got higher level processors, GPUs, et cetera, that you're deploying this on. We get to the point where they are different. They're typically statistically insignificant, and can kind of just be in that ebb and flow of, hey, if it's deployed in one country where that's what you're utilizing it on, and that's what it gets trained on, it tends to get better with that, proportionate ethnicity. And when it gets deployed in another area with a different ethnicity, and that's what it starts to get trained on, it becomes better with that ethnicity, right? Almost again like the human eye and our own individual biases when you're talking about artificial intelligence. That's what happens. And it's not, again, inherent in the technology so much as the fact that, where it's used more, it gets better. And where it's exposed to less, sometimes it doesn't perform quite as well at that point in time.
I think that's one of the things the general public just doesn't really understand when you're talking about artificial intelligence and machine learning, is that it's one of those things where it, in essence, has a brain and is learning and it gets better at time. Yeah. And for the most part, people are looking at it as a calculator. 2 + 2 gives you 4 every single time. Yeah. And it's just something that,
And if it says 3.9, something's wrong with it, right? And in this case, that's not really true. It's just, right? Again, that's where it's at in its evolution at that point in time and what it's been exposed to. So, yeah.
Right. Well, that's a great point to leave it at before we go into the future of where this solution is going in segment 3. Remind everyone you are listening to the Risk Advisor podcast hosted by myself, Jim Henry, and Sal Lafreri. We invite you to comment on our blog at theriskadvisor.com and to subscribe and follow us on our social media like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you are interested in having one or both of us speak at an upcoming event or would like to consult with us, please go to our webpage at theriskadvisor.com to set that up. So we're seeing calls from some quarters to ban the utilization of facial recognition.
Can I just throw a proviso in here?
Yeah.
I'll just apologize for what he may say. The comments you've heard today are not necessarily that of the other co-host. just adding it.
No, but truly, I'm just speaking to the world that we live in right now. I mean, we're seeing with the polarization that's going on, we're seeing the far left going to the extreme of, calling to defund the police and what have you. Is facial recognition just going to be another tool that will be targeted to take away from law enforcement? I mean, they're taking away, stun guns and everything else to enable them, to do their job. Now, here's a tool that obviously can be used very effectively, to get the right bad guys instead of the wrong bad guys. I mean, that's the whole point of law enforcement and police work, is to make sure that you're not falsely accusing someone. Now, here's a tool, that can help them be more accurate. Yet there doesn't seem to be much logic, in what's being applied right now. It's anything that at this point can look to be anti-law enforcement is getting backing. Are you seeing, is this getting swept into that same,
Well, certainly we all see the calls, right, and the concerns and comments from various quarters, and it's, I just read a report actually from University of Michigan, the Ford School there, that looked at this and looked at it specifically in the area of education, all through K through 12, all the way through higher education, and facial recognition's use in education, and their recommendation is it shouldn't be used whatsoever. And again, all sorts of good, valid concerns that are brought up. You don't argue with any of those. But my concern or my argument with it really is that, instead of looking at that and saying, so what are the benefits? And it was really fairly one-sided in terms of all the things that can go wrong, right? And we need to look at all of these new technologies, every new technology. I think the concerns around the potential misuse are real. And clearly they're real because we've seen it done, at least in other countries, right? We know this is a technology that can be misused, right? And it's been proven. But the question, and I think the challenge that we have in this time for all of us, is that everything seems to be binary, right? It's either good or bad. It's either okay or not. It's a good technology or it's a bad technology. Technology it isn't inherently good or bad, all right? It depends on how we're going to use it and how people can use it and what processes we put in place. And just as with this analysis from University of Michigan, we looked at one side of the equation. It didn't seem to me when I read through the report, all 80 pages of it, that there was a whole lot of the other side of the equation in terms of all the benefits it can provide. But more importantly, there was very short shrift at the end given to, if we're going to deploy it, what do we need to do? And I think one of the SEA just came out with a set of guidelines and policies that said, hey, this is what we think needs to be done for the safe and ethical application of facial recognition in the markets. And it was a starting point. I thought it was a really very well thought through set of policies and guidelines. It needs a lot of fleshing out in real practice, but it was a really great start. And to me, I'm hopeful that calm heads will prevail and we can get away from the binary aspect of this and say, as with almost everything else in life, it's how we use it. And so let's put the right process, regulations, policies, ethical approaches in place to make sure it's used the way it's supposed to be used. In terms of law enforcement, as an example, I don't think there's anything wrong to say, hey, we have examples where law enforcement used a picture that kind of looked like a guy that we saw, and it was a movie star, and we didn't have a picture of the real suspect, but we used this one that was a movie star, and we fed that into the system and said, you know what? You shouldn't be doing that because that kind of breaks the technology, right? But also sitting there saying, hey, if you got a warrant for somebody, right, and you got their vision and it's a threat, you ought to be looking for them, and we ought to be using every aspect that we have at our disposal, right, to keep people safe. To track down a terrorist, a kidnapper, or whatever else the case may be. So in my mind, there's no reason that we can't get to a place that says, this is what makes sense. We're going to start it with those SEA policies and procedures. We're going to build on that from a regulatory standpoint. But it really takes people willing to have that discussion, look at both sides of the equation, and work through that, as opposed to being anxious to jump to just the good or bad side of the equation.
Well, logic would suggest, certainly suggest. I mean, when stop and frisk was first put in by NYPD, years ago, the cops were armed with just their general
question and frisk.
Stop, question, and frisk.
Stop, question, and frisk.
But it was, to a degree, it was I'll use the word profiling of somebody that they think that there was a crime that was committed, kind of looks like this, kind of looks like that, right? Or their judgment of, mannerisms or whatnot as to somebody, was suspicious or not. That's a lot more subjective and a lot more at risk of being wrong than, as this technology moves along, to be aided. If you actually have the identification of a person, that is a suspect, to be aided with that much more accurate filter, that's much fairer, to everybody involved, that they're not going to be, falsely suspected, of a crime.
But the part that bothers me about all of it is that, again, yes, it is the technology and it is a tool to be used, but it's not the be all and end all, right? If spent 20 years, practicing law enforcement, right? If I had someone who was identified in facial recognition, popped up and said, here's your suspect, I couldn't go out and lock that person up based solely on that picture. And that's where I think the argument keeps getting lost, is that it's not the automatic identifier. It's not the DNA. And you're not locking that person up because of that picture. You need to have all the other supporting evidence to go with it. You need the fingerprints. You need the DNA. You need the eyewitnesses. Right? You need the statements. You need all of that to put together the case. It drives me absolutely crazy when people say, well, facial recognition shouldn't be used as a bad technology. Why? I mean, the fact of if you could effect an arrest based on the computer spitting out your picture, saying you're the guy, okay, then I can see them bitching about it. But how do you bitch about something where, hey, how many times does the system spit out a couple of pictures, 3 or 4 pictures of somebody that are close? You still have to go through the elimination process before you're effecting the arrest. Yeah. And that's why I think is the unfair knock with this, is they're treating it like it's DNA and it's not.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's important, right, is again, understanding what those use cases really are. You give that example. I had no problem putting a picture of a suspect into the hands of hundreds of beat cops to say, be aware, go look for this somebody. But we can't do the same thing essentially with a camera that's more accurate in identifying that individual, right? To do the same thing, right? Identify and then question and follow up from there. But
yeah, if you wanted to cut down the number of stops in the street, let them have the access to the facial recognition where it lowers the pool.
Right, the higher accurate approach. Yeah. But people don't see it that way, for better or worse. There's misinformation out there. There's so much of that, in this day and age. And I think a lot of it comes back down to education, transparency, and trust, right? And I think for the adoption of any, new technology that can have these sorts of implications, it really comes down to those 3 elements. And right now we're really lacking in all 3 of those. Education, people don't really understand the use case, right? What that means. Can I be arrested on that? Does it just mean, it's the next step? It's being used in so many different ways. And there's so much noise out there. They don't understand the use case. There isn't a lot of transparency at times, right? Into how we're using it. So, that means people start to, misinformation starts to pervade. People don't post, hey, this is how we're utilizing, this is what we can do, et cetera. And the trust with whatever those institutions are, whether they're law enforcement, whether it's, a corporation deploying it, whatever the case may be, we've seen an erosion there as well, right? So those are the 3 elements to me that are the real impediments at the moment. Obviously, you need to put the framework, you need to put everything else in place. And that means we've got a real challenge as an industry, right, to work through those. I think the SIA guidelines help. I think we need to be advocates for the technology. We need to work on education. We need to encourage users of it, whether governments or enterprises or others, to be truly very transparent in how they're using it, what their policies are, right? Letting people understand how it's being utilized. And then, we've got to hope that we can start to enter into a world where there's greater level of trust between groups, because that is sorely lacking at the moment.
So, advice for security personnel who may be interested in facial recognition solutions, and I would think that would kind of line up with the forewarning that I was giving people way back 30 years ago, I guess, when PCs first became popular, and anybody with a PC and a software programmer considered themselves to be in the access control business, right?
Yeah.
And clearly, the tools are out there now for even armchair developers, to create their own little facial recognition software, and it can, on the surface, it can look like it works, and it can be real cheap, but the worst thing that can happen is when you're using it, and not to the degree to what Sal was saying is, like DNA, but, even if it's to narrow down a certain set of suspects or to be using it as a commercial tool, even for marketing, accuracy is really important. So, what advice would you give for those security personnel that are considering systems? What do they got to watch out for?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Jim. And to me, there's two things. One is, as we talked about earlier, that although the technology can be highly accurate and very sophisticated at this point, we are still at that stage where there's a wide variation between good and bad, right? So look for reputable vendors. Look for folks that have studies, that have deployments that you can look at, that have done the testing, that are going to have the support, right? That understand, and again, understand it's not generic, right? Different use cases have different requirements, whether it's in cameras and lighting and positioning. A lot of folks sit there and they've got a camera on the entrance to their lobby, and it's 20 feet high, coming down at an angle, catching everybody sideways, and they want to use it for facial recognition, and then they wonder why it doesn't work, right? So you need to work with experts, right, to make sure that you separate the wheat from the chaff. And looking at the good technology, and it is out there and is highly capable, but you've got to understand the use case and match what you're using to the situation that you've got. So that's number one. And then number two, I think it really comes back to all the non-technology stuff, right? The things that we've been talking about here. And I think they'll see guidelines are an excellent place to start, but it really comes down to understanding exactly what you want to use it for. It's not a panacea. It's not, hey, do everything with now. It's like, okay, it's provided to make sure only our employees are coming in, and that other ones are funneled off. It's used to, if we've got people on a watch list, right, whatever the case may be, to make sure that you've got transparency around the policies that you put in place. If you're using an enterprise environment, make sure your employees are aware, and we've got folks that have deployed it to make sure they've got the right people in the right places of a building. They've got access cards, and that's fine, but then they need a higher level of granularity to make sure people, are safe in an area of a manufacturing facility where they're supposed to be. And, the initial reaction to everybody is no, right? And then you sit there and say, this is how we're using it. This is where the information is used. This is why, and the opinion changes, but it comes through that education, that transparency. So I think they'll see guidelines. Data privacy, you've got to make sure that you've got a vendor and a partner and your own tools and IT department that really can look after and make sure, privacy is a valid concern. I think, again, people don't understand everything that means. When something is a unique algorithm that can only be read by a specific vendor or software program, and if it gets hacked, it's meaningless. Just know what that means, right? But privacy is a real concern. Cybersecurity is a real concern. And so you need to make sure that you're looking at that side of the equation as well, and that you are working with someone who understands those elements and can be a trusted advisor on not just the technology, but the deployment.
Oh, that's very sound advice. Very sound advice. So I want to thank Alan for being our guest today. You've been listening to the Risk Advisor podcast, hosted by Jim Henry and Sal Lafreri. We ask you to subscribe to this show and like us on our social media sites like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you are interested in having one or both of us speak at an upcoming event or would like to consult with us, please go to our webpage at theriskadvisor.com to set that up. Also, if you know of someone that would make a great guest, please go to our webpage at theriskadvisor.com and make your suggestion. Remember, you can hear the show on your favorite podcast platform YouTube, and of course, stream it at theriskadvisor.com. Thanks again for listening, and we hope you tune in next week.